Leonard Glass was not a man you forgot after meeting him, mostly because he never let you forget. Everything about him was designed to dominate. His voice sharp and surgically cold, his suits always a bit too shiny, like he couldn't decide if he was a billionaire or a Bond villain. And his eyes, those infamous empty blue eyes, looked at the world as if it owed him an apology just for existing in his presence. He was the founder and CEO of Glassworks Technologies, a multinational software empire that claimed to connect people to possibilities. But behind the polished branding and TED Talk charisma, Leonard was something far less poetic. He was cruel, not in the cinematic, exaggerated sense. No, his cruelty was precise, real, modern, and corporate. It started small. A barista with shaky hands accidentally added whole milk instead of oat milk. Leonard spat the first sip back into the cup and shoved it across the counter. "This is New York," he said, not yelling, but loud enough for the room to hear. "Not Iowa. Do your damn job or go back to whatever farm you came from." No one said a word. The barista, probably no older than 19, froze, lips quivering, the red rising in her cheeks. Leonard dropped a 20 on the counter like it was a handout, like a king flipping a coin to a beggar. Then he turned and walked out, leaving a room full of witnesses, too stunned to react. And that was just a Tuesday for him. His office, floor 78 of a midtown skyscraper, was a fortress of glass and silence. Employees there didn't speak above a whisper unless spoken to. Elevators were reprogrammed to never stop on his floor unless summoned. Every desk was measured to his visual standards, every laptop screen angled identically. If he walked by and caught you checking your phone, you were gone before the screen dimmed. Leonard didn't fire people. He erased them. Rumor had it he once flew a programmer out to Prague to fix a bug, only to fire him the moment it was patched. Efficiency, Leonard had said later, when someone from HR tried to question the move. You don't let broken code sit, you delete it. But the thing about power, especially when you believe you're untouchable, is that you start to rot from the inside long before the world notices the smell. In 2007, Leonard was at the peak of his empire. Glassworks had just acquired a rival firm. Their stock had surged 40% in a quarter, and Leonard had been named one of the 10 tech titans by Forbes. He graced magazine covers with his smug, perfect smirk and was routinely invited to elite galas, where he'd take perverse pleasure in insulting caterers, mispronouncing names on purpose, and asking women if they were hired or attending. And still, he was admired, revered even, because money forgives. And Leonard had enough of it to rewrite the rules as he pleased. Then came the afternoon at Harper's Cafe. It was raining hard, sharp sideways rain that made the sidewalks shine like obsidian. Leonard arrived with two of his assistants, wearing a black trench coat that looked custom-made for intimidation. The cafe was small, warm, humming with low conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. A janitor was mopping near the door. She was older, maybe mid-50s, her hands in blue gloves that barely concealed the redness of her knuckles. Leonard walked right through her bucket, water splashing onto his shoes. He stopped, looked down, and slowly turned to face her. "You absolute idiot," he said, voice low but edged with venom. "You see me walking, and you think it's a good time to play puddles? Do you know what these shoes cost?" She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, but he cut her off. "I don't want your excuses," he said, stepping toward her. "I want you to understand that people like you are the reason people like me need driver-only lanes, private elevators, and closed doors." He grabbed a napkin from a nearby table, bent down as if to clean the splash on his shoe, then tossed the crumpled, wet paper right at her chest. It stuck for a second before sliding off and falling onto her mop. The cafe had fallen silent. Everyone watched, but no one moved. Leonard adjusted his cufflinks and turned toward the counter. "What are you all looking at?" he barked. "Make my coffee." One man raised his phone, quietly filming. Leonard didn't notice, or didn't care. And then he laughed, a sharp barking sound that shattered the tension like glass, as if the humiliation of that woman had been a private joke with the universe. He grabbed his coffee, took a sip, and tossed a $100 bill onto the counter. Consider this a tip for tolerating the scent of failure. He walked out, assistants in tow, trench coats swirling behind him like a curtain before the final act. The video hit the internet that night. At first, it was shared in corners of the web. Then it was picked up by an influencer. Then a blogger. Then someone added subtitles, a dramatic musical sting, and the hashtag #Challenge Within 24 hours, it was everywhere. Talk shows replayed it. Commentators dissected it. Celebrities retweeted it. Even politicians mentioned it, decrying the entitled cruelty of the elite. But Leonard doubled down. He went on CNBC and smirked through questions, said it was performance art, and people love to be offended. It's free entertainment. He mocked the janitor, claiming she tried to wet assault him. His lawyers filed a cease and desist on anyone using the video for profit. He believed it would blow over. It always had before. But this time, something shifted. Not because it was worse, but because it was recorded. It was shareable. It was undeniable. And for the first time, the world didn't just whisper behind his back. It growled. The video, shaky and shot from a phone that had seen better days, lasted just under 40 seconds. But in that time, it captured everything. The slow-motion cruelty, the silence of the room, the woman flinching as the napkin struck her chest. And most damning of all, Leonard Glass laughing as he walked away, like a man who had just crushed a bug. It spread with the efficiency of wildfire and the weight of a confession. By morning, it was already viral. By noon, it was a movement. Glasshole. It was sharp, brutal, and impossible to ignore. People began sharing their own stories. Tweets, Reddit posts, shaky videos from past encounters. Some were small, insults, public belittling, sudden firings. Others were worse. Allegations of threats, harassment. Even one claim that Leonard had personally ordered a janitor fired at a hotel for not recognizing him quickly enough. The internet had found its villain, and it refused to let go. TV pundits took sides. On one network, a smiling anchor called the janitor overly sensitive. On another, a psychologist explained in detail the trauma of public humiliation. Daytime talk shows staged reenactments. Memes exploded. One went viral showing Leonard as a Disney villain, hurling coffee at cartoon mice. Another looped his laugh with captions that read, "When your soul is for rent." But underneath the mockery, something darker was moving. People weren't just angry, they were remembering. It started with a barista in Brooklyn. Her name was Elena Miralles. She posted a long Facebook note, raw, emotional, detailing the time Leonard had berated her for forgetting to warm his almond croissant. He hadn't just insulted her, he had humiliated her in front of customers, called her dead behind the eyes, and thrown the croissant into the trash with a theatrical sniff. She cried in the back for 2 hours before quitting that night. The post was shared 20,000 times in 2 days. Then came Thomas, a driver for a luxury car service. He posted a video from his dash cam, 3 years old but still intact, showing Leonard throwing his luggage out of the trunk because Thomas didn't open the car door fast enough. You could hear the thud of the suitcase hitting the curb. You could hear Leonard yelling, "Why do I even pay for this if you can't read my mind?" Soon people began digging, looking for anything connected to Leonard Glass. A journalist found a court record, sealed but partially leaked, showing that Leonard's company had settled a case in 2010 involving a pregnant delivery driver who slipped on black ice outside their campus. Leonard had apparently refused to call for help, claiming, "If she can't handle walking, maybe she shouldn't be delivering anything." The driver had miscarried. Suddenly, the original video wasn't an isolated incident. It was a match dropped into a forest of dry, waiting kindling. The internet was not known for its mercy. But this wasn't vengeance. It was justice wearing a new face. Digital, loud, and terrifyingly efficient. Within days, protesters gathered outside Glassworks headquarters. Not huge at first, maybe 24, but the signs were brutal. "He fired me for having cancer. Glass is toxic. We are not bugs on your windshield." The company tried to downplay it. issued a short press release saying, "We are aware of the video and continue to support Leonard Glass's leadership." That only added fuel. Investors started to murmur, then question, then panic. The stock dipped. Not a crash, yet, but enough to send alarm through the sleek offices of the Glassworks boardroom. A leaked email showed one executive suggesting, "We may need to consider a statement of contrition, at least symbolically." Leonard's reply, found hours later on a leaked Slack message, was short. "I don't apologize to insects." That line became infamous. Within a day, it was plastered on posters, on protest banners, on a t-shirt worn by a teenage boy standing in front of Glass's penthouse building, grinning at a row of paparazzi. "I don't apologize to insects." It was too late to take it back, and yet Leonard was unbothered. In a GQ interview conducted days after the blow-up, he doubled down again. "I'm not running a preschool. This world is too soft," he said. "If I made someone cry, maybe they needed to cry. Better to find out now they're not cut out for the real world. I'm not the villain, I'm the filter." The backlash grew teeth. A woman named Heather Ralston came forward. She had worked as a receptionist at Glassworks from 2006 to 2008. She described a culture of fear where employees were told never to speak directly to Leonard unless addressed, never to look him in the eye, and never to take the same elevator. She told a story about how once, during a fire drill, Leonard was accidentally trapped in a hallway because someone held the door too long. He'd assumed it was intentional. The next day, 3 departments were purged. People started organizing, quietly, online at first. A subreddit was created, Glass Shattered, as a gathering point for those who had suffered under Leonard's leadership. The stories were sobering. Many were anonymous at first, but as more joined, the fear began to lift. What started as outrage was evolving. It was becoming a case, a cause, something bigger than clicks. Among the users on that forum was a name that would soon matter far more than anyone realized: Meredith King Justice. At first, her comments were simple, encouraging, supportive. Then questions. Did he ever threaten your job after an incident? Was there a pattern of discrimination? Did he ever force you to sign an NDA? Were you ever injured while on site and told not to report it? No one knew yet who she was, just that she was listening. One evening, in a thread titled, "He ruined my life, but I'm scared to speak," a user wrote, "He called me trash in front of my son for handing him the wrong hotel key. I still dream about it." And under it, Meredith King Justice replied, "You're not trash, you're evidence." The movement was no longer just about outrage. It was about building a reckoning. The movement was no longer just about outrage. It was about building a reckoning. The first person to meet Meredith King in person was Thomas Landon, the chauffeur with the dash cam footage. They sat at a quiet diner just outside the city, a place where no one cared who you were unless you tipped well. Meredith was younger than he expected, mid-30s, but with the posture of someone who had spent years arguing against giants. Her eyes were sharp, not just observant, but hungry for truth. "Tell me everything," she said, folding her hands over a yellow legal pad. And so he did. Thomas described his short, miserable stint driving Leonard Glass for a high-end car service. Leonard had been a regular client, high-paying, high-pressure. Drivers were warned in advance. Don't speak unless spoken to, keep the temperature precisely 72 degrees, and never make eye contact through the rearview mirror. The night Thomas was fired, Leonard had been in a foul mood. The ride had barely begun when Leonard noticed the classical music station wasn't the one he liked. He exploded, called Thomas auditory garbage, and made him pull over on the FDR just to berate him on the side of the highway. Then he took his suitcase and walked away, demanding the company fire the imbecile or find themselves a new corporate client. They did. "I had a newborn at home," Thomas said, staring into his coffee. "And my wife, she still doesn't know why I lost that job. I couldn't say it." It felt like admitting I was weak. Meredith nodded, scribbled a few notes, then reached into her folder and slid a document across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Preliminary paperwork," she said. "If we move forward with a class action, We'll need your full story and permission to use your dashcam footage. You'd be one of the core plaintiffs. Thomas stared at the page, then slowly reached for the pen. He wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, Meredith met with dozens of people. Some came through referrals, others through the growing subreddit, and a few even reached out through anonymous tips. They weren't just ex-employees. They were delivery workers, temps, catering staff, people who had crossed paths with Leonard Glass in hotels, at airports, at fundraisers and parties. All of them told the same kind of story. He treated them like furniture. Worse, like faulty, replaceable furniture. One of the most heartbreaking cases came from a woman named Darlene Brooks. She was 57, had worked as a janitor for 2 decades, and was the woman in the now infamous cafe video. The splash of mop water, the napkin, the laugh. Meredith met her at a senior center in Queens. "I didn't want all this attention," Darlene said quietly, eyes downcast. "I've been cleaning floors since I was 17. Never had a problem until that man came in." She explained that after the video went viral, her face was everywhere. Her name leaked, though she hadn't spoken to the media. People treated her like a symbol, a cause. But behind the viral fame was a broken truth. She'd lost her job the week after the incident. Not because of the video, because the management didn't want the disruption. "Do you want to fight him?" Meredith asked. "I want him to know I'm not nothing," Darlene whispered. "That's all I want." Meredith took her hand. "Then we'll make sure he knows." There was also Andrew Cho, a former software tester at Glassworks who had been fired for filing a complaint. He described being screamed at by Leonard in front of an entire development team over a crash bug. "You ever been shouted at so hard your ears ring?" Andrew asked. "It wasn't just rage, it was calculated. He wanted me small. He wanted fear in the room." The final story that broke Meredith's composure came from Rosa Medina, a bike courier who had been 8 months pregnant in 2010 when she slipped on an icy marble floor at Glassworks headquarters. She hadn't been delivering to Glassworks, just cutting through the lobby when Leonard spotted her lying on the floor, moaning. "He walked past me," Rosa said, her voice shaking. "Didn't even stop, just said, 'That's what you get for thinking you belong in our building.'" She'd miscarried that night in the emergency room. There had been a payout. Quiet, legal, just enough to make the problem disappear. Rosa hadn't fought it then. She needed the money to cover the hospital bills. But now she wanted something else. "They think pain is temporary," Rosa said, "but it stays in the bones." Meredith started assembling the case like a mosaic, individual tragedies forming a larger pattern. The abuse wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. Leonard had built a culture where disrespect wasn't just tolerated, it was weaponized. And it wasn't only about being rude, it was about exploiting the voiceless. Then came the legal breakthrough. A Glassworks contractor, who asked to be called Alan for safety, contacted Meredith anonymously. He had access to internal company memos, some of which had been scrubbed from public view. One memo from 2009 described a policy change. Non-executive interactions with Leonard Glass are considered external liabilities. All incidents must be redirected or managed via secondary staff. Emotional responses to directives will be treated as disciplinary events. Another included a chilling line. Employees are to remember, the CEO is not obligated to accommodate personal sensitivities or grievances unless required by law. Meredith's hands trembled as she read it. She could already hear it in court. This wasn't just a mean man. This was a hostile environment engineered from the top down. And hostile environments were a legal landmine. More documents arrived, NDAs with bullying language, medical waivers that seemed coercive, internal reports marked incidents suppressed. The case wasn't just real, it was winnable. Meredith prepared the first draft of the lawsuit. 32 plaintiffs, 7 categories of abuse. Dozens of attachments, testimonials, and evidence files. She gave it a name, Landon et al. Versus Glassworks Technologies, Inc. and Leonard Glass in personal and professional capacity. Then one morning before sunrise, she filed it. It was quiet at first, until the media got hold of it, and then the war began. The morning the lawsuit was filed, Leonard Glass was sitting in the back of a private SUV, sipping imported mineral water from a glass bottle chilled to exactly 40 degrees. His driver, who he hadn't bothered to learn the name of, was crawling through traffic on Fifth Avenue, and Leonard was growing restless. "What are we doing, inching toward the apocalypse?" he muttered. "Did you pass your driving exam by mail?" The driver said nothing. Leonard was halfway through composing a blistering email to a department head about a missed KPI report when his phone buzzed. Not the usual chime of an investor update or a market alert. This was the distinct tone reserved for media monitoring from his PR team. Subject line: class action filed against Glassworks, alleging workplace abuse, discrimination, emotional harm. He blinked once, twice, then opened the email. The PDF was attached. It was 84 pages long. He didn't read it, not at first. Instead, he called his legal chief. "George," Leonard said, "why am I hearing about this from Google Alerts?" There was a pause. "We were just about to call you. We didn't expect them to file today." "You're paid to expect things." Another pause. Leonard swiped through the early headlines. The Glass Cracks class action accuses tech mogul of systemic abuse. They called me trash. 32 plaintiffs take on Leonard Glass. Glass hole goes legal. The documents were already online, dissected by legal analysts and social media watchdogs. Screenshots of the most damning internal memos were spreading like infection. A 22-second supercut of plaintiff testimonials had already racked up over 1 million views. No music, just faces, just pain. Meredith King held a press conference that afternoon. She stood at a podium, plain navy suit, no theatrics, no teleprompter. Her voice was measured, her statements precise. "This is not about cancel culture. This is about accountability. This is about human dignity in the face of weaponized power. This is about people who were broken down systematically, shamed publicly, silenced with money, and discarded like trash." Behind her stood 11 of the 32 plaintiffs. Some had faces the internet already recognized. Others were stepping forward for the first time. Meredith continued, "We have evidence of wrongful termination, of workplace intimidation, of coercive NDAs, of ignored injuries, of personal insults that led to depression, suicide ideation, and trauma responses consistent with PTSD. And above all, we have a pattern that shows Leonard Glass was not simply abusive, he was institutionalized cruelty, cloaked in money." The questions from the press were relentless. Was she prepared for a long legal battle? Was she worried about going against such a powerful opponent? Meredith didn't flinch. "This is what I became a lawyer for." The next 72 hours were chaos. Glassworks stock fell 11%, then 18%. One of their lead investors made a quiet exit, then another. Partner companies issued bland public statements about reevaluating corporate relationships. A foreign client pulled a $60 million contract. Inside Glassworks headquarters, meetings were tense and panicked. Communications staff begged Leonard to issue a statement of apology, a video, a donation, something. "No," he said, pacing his office with the lawsuit document finally in hand. "Apologies are currency, and I don't spend mine on peasants." His legal team advised immediate damage control. Leonard, George, his chief counsel, said, "This isn't like the other scandals. You don't have one accuser, you have 32. And King isn't just loud, she's smart. She filed in a district court known for sympathy toward workers. She's got medical records, signed statements, footage. So, we've buried worse. We haven't buried this many." Leonard turned to the window, the glass reflecting a sky that looked more like steel. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. "Then let's remind them who they're dealing with." And so the counterattack began. Leonard's private investigators were unleashed. They dug into every plaintiff's past: parking tickets, divorces, social media posts from 2008. One plaintiff had once tweeted a tasteless joke. Another had been briefly on probation as a teenager. Leonard's team packaged this information into character assessments and leaked them anonymously to tabloids. It didn't work. The public didn't buy it. Because unlike Leonard, the world understood what it meant to be imperfect and still deserve dignity. Then he targeted Meredith. Anonymous threats, harassing voicemails. One night, someone shattered the windows of her office. She didn't flinch. She responded the next day by doubling the number of plaintiffs. Now it was 43. Leonard tried to silence them. He filed injunctions. He offered settlements to individuals, money, NDAs, security jobs. But Meredith had prepared them for this. She'd made one thing clear from the beginning. If you want justice, you have to want it more than money. They did. The plaintiffs began to speak publicly, not as victims, but as survivors, as people taking back the narrative. Elena Morels appeared on a podcast and described how she used to cry on the subway after work. Thomas Landon gave an interview about the humiliation of being fired in front of a crowd. Darlene Brooks, the janitor from the cafe, sat down with a morning show and, with trembling hands, said, "I've cleaned floors my whole life, but nothing's ever felt as dirty as the way he looked at me." The internet rallied. A GoFundMe to support legal costs broke 500,000 in 2 days. Influencers, actors, even a few former Glassworks employees who had once stayed silent began speaking out. A Glassworks executive resigned and issued a statement calling Leonard a cancerous presence in modern leadership. The case was no longer just about one man. It was about power, about how far it could go before someone, anyone, stood up and said, "Enough." And still, Leonard believed he could win. Not in court, not really, but in the long game. He thought money always won, that headlines faded, that people forgot. He underestimated what pain remembers. He underestimated how deep humiliation scars. He underestimated Meredith King. Leonard Glass didn't sleep much, even in the best of times. Now, as the lawsuit tightened around him like a noose woven from every insult he'd ever dismissed, sleep became optional. He paced more, snapped more, refused meals, refused meetings unless they were war rooms. The man who had once sat atop the tech world like a sneering god had now become its most hated symbol. Not because he failed, but because he had made it very clear. He thought the rest of the world was beneath him, and now the rest of the world had teeth. But Leonard didn't believe in defeat, only in leverage, and he still had plenty. "Kill the momentum," he told his legal team one morning, his voice like cold steel drawn across stone. "If you can't kill the case, kill the movement." He began with private surveillance. Every plaintiff, every public supporter of the lawsuit, watched, documented, followed. The goal wasn't evidence, the goal was fear. Anonymous calls started arriving, not threats, not directly, just quiet, unsettling voices. "You think anyone will hire you again after this circus? Maybe you don't want your medical records going public. Nice dog. Would be a shame if someone mistook it for a stray." Meredith King knew immediately where it came from. She called a meeting with her plaintiffs and reminded them this was the death rattle of a man who built an empire on silence, and silence was dying. Still, the toll was real. Elena Morales found her apartment door covered in crude drawings, mocking her weight in her past depression. Rosa Medina received a fake delivery that turned out to be a box of broken glass with a note, "Handle with care, like I did." But then, just as Leonard's tactics were ramping up, something happened he didn't expect. Someone started leaking his secrets. It began with an anonymous email to Meredith containing an internal spreadsheet from Glassworks marked tiered retention model. It listed employees and contractors categorized by their compliance probability and legal volatility. Many had notes like, "Will settle quietly if threatened with immigration review." History of financial instability, use against him. Non-native English speaker, avoid verbal confrontation. It was damning, not just morally but legally. The language alone violated multiple labor laws. A week later, more documents arrived. They showed how Leonard had authorized settlement bonuses disguised as wellness reimbursements. They included transcripts of internal memos where Leonard personally referred to former employees as pests we exterminated with paperwork. The source was untraceable, but the material was undeniably real. Meredith leaned in. She followed the pattern, cross-referenced timestamps, pieced together who might have had access. Eventually, a name rose to the surface. A junior developer from 2012, someone long since disappeared from public view. His name was Caleb Morrow. He had been hired straight out of college, then fired less than a year later for allegedly failing to meet Leonard's energy expectations. A vague phrase used so often it became code for, "You didn't make him feel powerful enough." Meredith sent him a message through encrypted email. His reply came hours later. "I've been waiting 10 years for someone to ask." They met at a park outside Boston. Caleb looked older than his years. Tired eyes, skittish movements. But he brought a laptop filled with archives, emails, screen recordings, internal Slack threads saved in cold storage. He'd kept everything. "When they fired me," Caleb said, "they made me sign an NDA, but they didn't realize I'd already backed up the server snapshots I worked on. I was their DevOps guy. I had admin access. I just never knew what to do with it. Until now." Meredith asked why he kept it all. Caleb looked away for a moment, then said, "Because no one believed me. My girlfriend at the time thought I was exaggerating. My parents told me to move on. But I remember how it felt. The way he looked at me. Like I was some rotten file to be deleted." The next batch of leaks blew the case wide open. There were audio recordings. One captured Leonard berating an HR executive for suggesting empathy training. "We don't train wolves to smile. We feed them red meat." Another showed Leonard laughing with board members after a round of layoffs, mocking one former employee who had cried during her exit interview. The media turned rabid. Late-night shows ran compilations of Leonard's worst moments set to circus music. A parody account on social media called Glass Leaks posted daily quotes from the leaked files, and it quickly gained over 1 million followers. But not everyone was happy about the leaks. The court wasn't. The judge issued a warning to Meredith's team about evidence handling. But Meredith didn't flinch. She complied with every protocol, shared everything, filed everything, transparent, methodical. Meanwhile, Leonard panicked. He fired half his legal team, brought in a crisis firm that specialized in strategic narrative rebuilding. They released a slick video of Leonard walking solemnly through a rehab center, donating a check to a mental health organization. An obvious PR stunt. The internet wasn't buying it. One commenter wrote, "He's not sorry. He's just surprised we didn't stay quiet." Inside Glassworks, dissent began to stir. Employees whispered in hallways. Middle managers forwarded confidential emails to journalists. A VP in HR resigned and gave an anonymous interview calling Leonard's leadership a moral illness dressed in Armani. And then came the final crack in the mirror. A document surfaced that showed Leonard had personally intervened in a whistleblower case in 2011, pressuring an internal ethics committee to reclassify a sexual harassment complaint as disruptive behavior. It wasn't just about insults anymore. It was about rot, deep, systemic, personal. And through it all, Meredith King remained steady. She spoke less now. Let the evidence speak for her. Let the survivors speak for themselves. And they did. Not just in interviews, but in court declarations, media op-eds, community forums. People weren't afraid anymore. Leonard Glass had declared war. But he didn't realize the battlefield had changed. This wasn't a PR problem anymore. It was a reckoning. For years, Leonard Glass had been the embodiment of modern power. He was the man who didn't return calls. People waited for him. He didn't ask for deals. He snapped his fingers, and the market listened. His empire wasn't just money, it was influence, spun into every corner of business, media, and politics. But now the shimmer was dulling. The cracks weren't rumors anymore. They were visible, loud, and multiplying. The morning began with a phone call from the chairman of Dynatech, one of Glassworks' largest partner firms. Leonard answered with his usual clipped impatience. "We're pulling out," the chairman said, skipping pleasantries. Leonard sat up. "You're bluffing." "We're not. Your brand is toxic, Leonard. We've had 3 clients walk in 2 days just because we share a letterhead with you. Tell them the truth costs more than gossip." There was a pause. "You used to sound smart when you said things like that." Click. That same afternoon, a second hit arrived. Westbridge Capital, a firm that had poured over $400 million into Glassworks, filed a formal letter of concern with the board. The phrase irreparable brand damage appeared 3 times in a single paragraph. Their suggestion, suspend Leonard Glass as CEO pending investigation. Inside Glassworks, the air was different. The usual suffocating silence was replaced by a cautious buzz. Employees whispered in restrooms, glanced at each other in elevators. People who had once been too afraid to speak were now daring to imagine a world without Leonard. In an internal Slack channel, someone posted a meme, a glass building with a single crack running down the middle, labeled Hope. The message was quickly deleted, but not before it made the rounds. Then came the second viral incident. Leonard was a keynote speaker at a European tech summit in Berlin, a high-profile event streamed live to over 100,000 viewers. He wasn't supposed to attend, but insisted on showing the world he was untouchable. He walked on stage wearing a crisp suit and that signature smirk. But the audience didn't greet him with applause. They greeted him with tension. The topic was innovation. Leonard veered off script almost immediately. He began ranting about how disruption wasn't just about technology, it was about identifying dead weight and cutting it, whether it's code or people. He compared employee burnout to battery failure and said if a system didn't perform, you didn't recharge it, you recycled it. Then during a Q&A, a young man in a wheelchair took the mic. He introduced himself as a student of computer science. Calm, respectful. He asked, Mr. Glass, what responsibility does leadership hold for creating inclusive workspaces, not just for profit, but for humanity? Leonard looked at him, blinked, and then said, if you want sympathy, go to a poetry workshop. We build machines, not charities. A silence fell over the room like winter air. Then the moderator, clearly rattled, tried to move on. But the damage was done. That clip hit the internet within hours. By the end of the day, it had 23 million views. The comments were savage. This isn't tech. This is cruelty. Leonard Glass, innovator of inhumanity. Imagine being that rich and still that small. Glassworks' stock took a nosedive, 20% in 1 week. A Forbes columnist published an op-ed titled, When Empires Rot from the Top. A viral Twitter thread compiled Leonard's quotes, layered them against footage of crying employees, leaked internal messages, and the Berlin video. And still, Leonard refused to step down. Let them panic, he told his closest advisors. Let them burn. The ones who survive the fire are the only ones worth keeping. But he was running out of fire and followers. His PR chief resigned with a single line. I can no longer attach my name to this legacy. 3 more VPs followed in silence. His calendar, once a battlefield of overbookings, was suddenly open. Even the media, once split in their stance, now turned fully. Headlines didn't call him controversial. They called him what he was, a tyrant in a tailored suit. And then came the board meeting. The first one Leonard didn't schedule himself. 11 members, 10 screens lit up. 1 chair was empty. Leonard stared at them through the video feed like a king surveying treason. The chairman spoke first. Leonard, there is an emergency vote on the table. For what? He snapped. To suspend you as CEO pending legal and ethical review. Leonard laughed. Legal and ethical review? Of what? I've built this company from nothing. There's no Glassworks without me. One board member, quiet, older, finally spoke. You also built a culture of cruelty, Leonard, and we're now drowning in the cost of it. Leonard stood up, face red, furious. You're all cowards. You came here on my jet, drank my wine, pitched your sons for jobs in my divisions. Don't pretend you're saints now. No one responded. The vote passed. 7-2. He was suspended, effective immediately. His access badge was revoked that night. In the hallway of his penthouse, Leonard stared at the lock screen of his company tablet. The Glassworks logo, once his personal seal of dominance, now refused to open for him. He threw the tablet across the room. It shattered on impact. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. But Leonard Glass wasn't done. Because in the cold quiet that followed his fall from power, he began to plan something else. Something no one expected. The courthouse was nothing special, gray stone, stiff chairs, buzzing lights, but the world made it feel like a cathedral. Cameras crowded the sidewalk. News vans lined the street like ambulances at the scene of a cultural car crash. Protesters waved signs. Fans of Meredith King carried banners. Former employees of Glassworks wore buttons that read, "I survived the glass house." Inside, the air was tight with tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just another lawsuit. This was a reckoning dressed in legal briefs. A courtroom drama not about money, but about dignity, pain, and whether the powerful could still be held accountable in public. Leonard Glass entered the room like a man walking into a boardroom he already owned. His suit was perfect. His jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the crowd with icy calculation. When he passed the plaintiff's bench, he smirked. But no one flinched. Meredith King sat with 43 plaintiffs. Some looked nervous, some were silent, but none looked away. They weren't just people anymore. They were proof. The trial opened with a simple statement from the judge. This court is not here to determine whether Mr. Glass is popular, wealthy, or charming. We are here to determine whether his actions caused real harm and whether those actions were protected by law or prosecuted by it. And with that, the stage was set. Meredith began her case with precision, no theatrics, no grand speeches, just stories, human stories, stacked one after the other like bricks in a wall too tall to climb over. She called Thomas Landon to the stand first. He spoke calmly about his years as a professional driver, about the day Leonard threw his luggage onto the sidewalk and berated him for a wrong playlist. When he described standing on the shoulder of the FDR, heart pounding as Leonard screamed at him while other cars sped by, you could hear murmurs in the audience. Meredith played the dash cam footage. The courtroom watched Leonard's face on screen, saw the contempt, heard the words, "You work for me like gravity works for Earth, constant, invisible, not worth noticing until it fails." Next came Elena Morell. She described her time working at a downtown coffee shop and the day Leonard made her cry over a croissant. Her voice shook when she said, "It wasn't just what he said, it was how loud he said it. He made sure people heard, because humiliation was the point." Darlene Brooks took the stand after that, the janitor, the woman in the cafe video that had started everything. She sat straight, hands folded, eyes clear. "I've worked my whole life to stay invisible," she said, "to be quiet, to do my job, get my check, and leave. But that man, he made sure I couldn't be invisible that day. He wanted everyone to see me as trash." Her voice cracked then, but she kept going. "I didn't want revenge. I wanted to disappear again. But Ms. King told me I didn't have to, that maybe this once I could stand and say, I matter." Meredith called experts next. A psychologist explained the effects of chronic public humiliation. A workplace safety consultant outlined the ignored incidents, the misclassified injuries. A former Glassworks HR manager, appearing under subpoena, testified that Leonard had personally blocked employee complaints and threatened departments that wasted his time with feelings. The defense tried to punch holes. They argued Leonard's behavior was abrasive but not illegal. They claimed the workplace was demanding, not dangerous. They called his insults tough love, his firings strategic. But the plaintiffs kept coming. Rosa Medina described her fall, the ignored cries for help, the miscarriage. Meredith introduced the hospital records, the floor safety reports, the internal emails that showed Leonard laughed about slippery liabilities. Each piece built upon the next, and then came the recording. It hadn't been publicly released before the trial. Meredith had saved it, a 10-minute audio file taken from a Glassworks employee's phone during an all-hands meeting in 2011. In it, Leonard could be heard joking that humiliation is a currency and that you keep people sharp by making them bleed a little. At one point he said, "Empathy is a bug, not a feature. I don't want loyal employees. I want desperate ones. They work harder." When it played, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward. Leonard didn't blink. The defense tried to recover. They claimed the recording was taken out of context. They implied Meredith had coached the plaintiffs, but each attack fell flat. And then Leonard did something no one expected. He took the stand. His lawyers had begged him not to, but he insisted. He believed he could win the jury the way he had won investors, with swagger, dominance, and disdain wrapped in eloquence. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, and looked at the jury like they were interns in his office. "Look," he said, "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to build things. Big things. Companies that employ thousands. Innovations that change the world. And sometimes that means breaking a few fragile egos. Is that a crime now?" He smiled. "I don't apologize for expecting greatness. And if someone couldn't handle the pressure, that's on them. We don't blame the sun for burning us. We put on sunscreen." He paused as if expecting applause. The jury stared at him in disbelief. Meredith rose for cross-examination. "You said, quote, 'I don't apologize to insects.' Do you still believe that?" Leonard shrugged. "Context matters." "Then explain the context where calling employees insects is leadership." Silence. "You laughed when a pregnant woman fell. You joked about firing someone who stuttered during a presentation. You threatened people who didn't look at the floor when you walked by. Is that also context?" Leonard's jaw tightened. "I lead with efficiency." Did efficiency require breaking people? No answer. Did it require humiliation, threats, coercion, physical harm? Still no answer. Or did you just enjoy it? Silence, heavy and final. The courtroom watched as Leonard's expression froze. Not from fear, but from something worse, recognition. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding the power, and he knew it. The verdict came on a Thursday. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. Outside, streets were barricaded to hold back the press, the protesters, the former employees who had traveled from across the country just to stand on the concrete and wait for justice to echo through the walls. Leonard Glass sat at the defense table, hands clasped, his lips a perfect line. No more smirks, no tie today. Just the expensive silence of a man who had never heard the word no from anyone who mattered. The jury filed in. 12 men and women who had heard every story, watched every clip, read every transcript, and sat through every painful moment of testimony. None of them looked at Leonard. Most looked at Meredith King. The foreman stood, voice clear. "In the matter of Landon et al. Versus Glassworks Technologies and Mr. Leonard Glass," the courtroom didn't breathe. "We, the jury, find the defendant liable on all counts." There was no explosion of noise, just a collective exhale, like a ghost being released from the room. Tears welled in eyes across the plaintiff's bench. Meredith nodded slowly, one hand gripping the table. The judge's gavel came down once. Then came the second part, compensatory damages. Leonard had expected a number, a fine, something big but survivable. He had braced for 8 figures, maybe 9. But the judge read a different kind of sentence. In light of the nature of the abuse, the systemic enabling by the corporate structure, and the long-term personal and psychological damage inflicted, this court awards the plaintiffs a total of $2.1 billion in damages to be paid personally by Mr. Glass and, where applicable, by the Glassworks corporate structure pending asset investigation. Leonard's lips parted just slightly. $2.1 billion. It wasn't just money, it was everything. The private jet, gone. The penthouse, under lien. His art collection, frozen. His ownership stake in Glassworks, already under review by the board, was effectively worthless. Institutional investors would abandon ship within the week. Legal analysts were already calling this the largest civil penalty ever imposed in a personal workplace misconduct case. Leonard stood up. Not out of respect. He didn't even seem to notice the movement. He said nothing. He just stared at Meredith King. And she met his eyes, not with malice, not with triumph, but with something far colder. Finality. Outside the courthouse, it was pandemonium. Reporters screamed questions. Cameras followed every flinch. But Meredith refused interviews. The plaintiffs left through a side exit, led by security. They didn't want a parade. They wanted peace. Leonard was escorted out minutes later. flanked by his last two remaining lawyers, both looking ashen. He didn't make it to his car before a man in the crowd shouted, "Still think we're insects now?" Leonard didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said it for him. In the days that followed, the collapse became complete. Glassworks stock plunged 62% in 4 trading days. The board convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to sever all remaining ties with Leonard. His name was scrubbed from the company website, removed from its origin story. The official press release didn't even mention him by name. Just, "We are entering a new era of leadership and responsibility." His bank accounts were audited. Several offshore accounts were frozen. Credit lines were revoked. The yacht, the Prometheus, was seized by federal marshals while docked in the Bahamas. Worse still, a separate investigation was opened into potential criminal violations, specifically around coerced non-disclosure agreements and employee intimidation that may have breached federal labor protections. He was no longer a man under scrutiny. He was a man under siege. In a private interview, his last before going completely silent, Leonard sat across from a journalist in a nearly empty luxury apartment he was renting month to month under a pseudonym. The camera never aired, but the recording circulated privately for months. In it, Leonard said quietly, "They broke the illusion. That's all. I didn't hurt anyone more than the world already does. I just stopped pretending, and now they want me to pay for being honest." He looked at the camera, eyes hollow. "You think they won because they got my money? Let them have it. The ones who stay angry after the payout. Those are the ones who really lost something." But the world didn't see it that way. One by one, the plaintiffs began to rebuild. Thomas Landon used part of his compensation to open a driving school for low-income students. Elena Morales went back to college and earned a degree in psychology. Darlene Brooks bought a home for the first time in her life and set up a small community trust to help aging service workers in Queens. Rosa Medina, now a mother of 2, founded an organization that provides legal assistance to pregnant women working in high-risk jobs. They didn't become heroes. They became whole. As for Meredith King, she declined television offers, magazine profiles, podcast series. She kept practicing law, quietly, deliberately. Her name became shorthand in the legal community for impossible made real. One magazine headline read, "She didn't just break the glass ceiling, she buried it." And Leonard? He vanished from public view. His properties were liquidated. His name, scrubbed from the list of tech visionaries, now appeared in textbooks under corporate downfall. He spent months fighting appeals that went nowhere. His former assistants published a tell-all. A documentary began production. But he never apologized, not once. Instead, he spent most of his days in a secluded estate he managed to retain through a legal loophole. A cottage in the woods of upstate New York, bought under a trust name years ago. No staff, no interviews, no mirrors in the house. It was said that sometimes he sat by the lake at night, watching his own reflection ripple and vanish in the water. Because when everything is taken, all that's left is the echo. For a while, it seemed the story had ended. Justice served, empire fallen, the powerful made to kneel before the weight of their own cruelty. But Leonard Glass had never been the type to let the curtain fall without one last performance. Even in disgrace, even stripped of wealth and titles, Leonard believed one thing. He was smarter than everyone else. Smarter than judges, juries, boards, banks, and certainly smarter than Meredith King. What the world didn't know, what he'd never allowed anyone to know, was that over the years, Leonard had prepared for the possibility of annihilation. Not because he feared it, but because he liked the idea of surviving it. It started with a network of trusts and shell companies, entirely legal in appearance, but as layered and twisted as a maze drawn by a mad architect. Offshore accounts, property titles in Luxembourg, Belize, the Isle of Man. Company stock rerouted through proxies and buried under the names of long-dead holding firms. He had quietly moved assets over the years, not in large, obvious chunks, but piece by piece. Paintings, patents, cash, all placed under the control of a single identity, an identity he created himself. In 2009, during the acquisition of a small East Coast robotics startup, Leonard had met a barista named Matthew Vale, 22, quiet, sharp eyes, too intelligent for his job. Leonard had insulted him for serving the wrong drink, called him invisible, and told the cafe manager to fire him on the spot. They did. Leonard forgot about it by lunch. Matthew didn't. He moved cities, changed jobs, went back to school, got a degree in business law, and when the leaks about Leonard began years later, he was the one who quietly reappeared. Not publicly, not loudly, but methodically. He contacted Meredith King under a different name, sent the first document, then another, then another. All of it real, all of it damning, and all of it coming from the inside. Because Matthew Vale wasn't just a victim, he was Leonard's shadow identity. In 2010, Leonard had created a completely fabricated person, using Matthew's name, but forged records and false credentials. That Matthew Vale became the listed owner of 5 holding companies, 2 estates, and millions in intellectual property. At first, it was just a clever way to dodge taxes. But then, Leonard began feeding that identity more and more assets, things he could reclaim one day if needed. Only he never counted on one thing. The real Matthew Vale would find out. It happened by accident in 2016 when Matthew requested a background check for a new job and discovered a credit alert. A trust account under his name had made a property transaction in Monaco. He dug deeper, quietly, patiently, and when the Glass scandal exploded in 2020, he made a decision. He didn't just expose Leonard, he took the identity back. Using every piece of paper Leonard had forged in his name, Matthew traced the path of ownership. He hired lawyers, quiet ones. He reclaimed legal rights to the companies, claimed the trusts, and placed the shell corporations under legitimate control. It took 2 years, and when the verdict against Leonard was announced and Leonard's last assets were being seized, Matthew struck. He submitted proof to the courts that Leonard had committed trust fraud and identity falsification. And in a hearing closed to the public, a federal judge ruled that because the entities were created under a real person's identity, without consent, they legally belonged to Matthew Vale. The value, over $300 million. When Leonard was notified, he thought it was a mistake. He demanded to see the paperwork. When he did, he stopped breathing for a full 15 seconds. On page 2 was a name he hadn't seen in over a decade. Matthew Vale. Not the one he'd created, the one he'd destroyed. Leonard tried to appeal, screamed about fraud, theft, identity abuse, but the courts sided with Matthew. Every transfer, every signature, every fake company that Leonard had built to protect himself had now been used to legally disarm him. He had created a financial fortress to outlast any storm, and given the keys to the very person he once called invisible. Reporters got wind of it weeks later. One headline read, "Glass Empire Looted by the Ghost of a Barista." Matthew never made a public statement. He didn't need to. He donated the majority of the recovered money to a new foundation created by the lawsuit's plaintiffs, a fund to protect workers from exploitation and abuse in tech and service industries. He named it the Echo Initiative. When Meredith King found out who he really was, she sent him a note. Just one line. "For someone invisible, you certainly left a mark." Leonard, now living in self-imposed exile, watched it all unfold from the shadows of his last legal refuge. He tried to sue. No court would take the case. He tried to rebuild. No bank would fund him. He tried to rewrite the narrative. But no one was listening. Because now when people spoke of Leonard Glass, they didn't just speak of cruelty or corruption. They spoke of a man who built a kingdom of mirrors and was shattered by the reflection he never thought would fight back. And the final irony? His last fortune wasn't taken by protesters. It wasn't taken by a judge or a jury. It was taken by someone he hadn't even bothered to remember. And that, more than anything, broke him. Because Leonard Glass could lose power. He could lose money. But to be undone by someone he thought didn't matter, that was the one loss he could never prepare for. No headline marked the final end of Leonard Glass. No broadcast carried the footage of his last days in the public eye. When empires fall with fire, the world watches. But when the ashes settle, there's only silence. He lived in a modest cottage now, if you could call it that. A gray structure nestled in the woods of upstate New York, bought years ago through one of the shell trusts that somehow, miraculously, hadn't been seized. Technically, it belonged to a holding company with no active staff and no public trail. He was allowed to stay, but couldn't legally rent, sell, or borrow against it. So he stayed, alone. No internet, no staff, no visitors. Occasionally, a grocery service dropped off boxes at the edge of the long gravel path leading to his house. They were paid in advance through a preloaded card. The delivery driver never saw the man who lived inside. Just a silhouette sometimes, glimpsed behind the curtains. Inside, Leonard's days were structured but empty. He read, walked, sat by the lake, and most often just stared out the window. He no longer made calls. No one picked up. He no longer tried to write memos, give speeches, pitch ideas into the void. His ideas had no audience anymore. The world had moved on. Even his name felt like a ghost, spoken only in textbooks and documentaries, mentioned in business ethics courses and media retrospectives with a tone of caution. There was no scandal that replaced him, no new monster to chase. The world didn't need one. It had learned what cruelty looked like in a suit, but elsewhere, away from the rot he left behind, other stories grew. The plaintiffs thrived in the slow, deliberate way that healing takes root. Thomas Landon, the chauffeur, ran his driving school with a sense of peace he never thought he'd know. He taught young people how to handle both cars and pressure. "The road doesn't care who you are," he said during a local interview. "It just needs you to stay steady." Elena Morales graduated with her psychology degree and opened a small practice focusing on workplace trauma. She kept a copy of the lawsuit framed in her office, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Darlene Brooks planted a garden in the yard of the house she bought with her settlement money. She grew lavender and tomatoes and let the soil teach her about patience. On Sundays, she volunteered at a senior center, not to clean, but to read. Rosa Medina launched a national campaign for maternal rights in labor-heavy industries. Her foundation helped rewrite safety protocols for delivery companies and won legislative support in 3 states. She became a face on magazine covers, not a symbol of loss, but of resilience. And Meredith King? She stayed in the courtroom. She turned down book deals, film options, and TV specials. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She wanted to keep working, quietly, fiercely. One morning, a reporter tried to ambush her outside her office. "Miss King, do you feel like you've changed the world?" She paused, thought about it. "No," she said, "but I helped a few people remember they had the right to fight. That's enough." Her next case wasn't flashy. It involved a warehouse. Immigrant workers. A corporate manager who withheld overtime pay. She approached it the same way she had approached Leonard's case, with fire. And Matthew Vale? He stayed in the background, just like he had promised himself he would. The money he retained was handled by a private team, all under a charitable trust. He never appeared on camera, never gave interviews. When asked why, he replied through an attorney, "I didn't take revenge. I reclaimed my name." There was eventually a film, Fall from Gold. It told the story with accuracy and style, though some of the names were changed and the timeline compressed. The final scene was fictional. Leonard Glass standing in a glass-walled office, looking out over a city that no longer bowed to him. But the real Leonard, the one in the woods, didn't watch it. Or maybe he did. No one could say. Sometimes locals reported seeing him walk near the lake in the early hours, when fog still clung to the water and the birds hadn't decided yet if the day was worth singing for. He would sit on a bench, still and wordless, as if waiting for something. Not redemption, not understanding, just a sound, a whisper, a sign that he still existed somewhere in the world beyond this exile. But the world had already answered him. It had answered in courtrooms and in kitchens, in classrooms and in cash registers, in every small moment when a worker raised their head and remembered what dignity felt like. And Leonard Glass? He remained, not in the way he had wanted, not as a titan or an icon, but as an echo, a warning, a name people remembered not to fear, but to never become.